Hello there, you're listening to the English Booster podcast and we're going to start with a quick test, okay? So right away, let's get straight to the point. Let's cut to the chase, another synonym. So how would you say in English, gdybym miała zmienić pracę, zostałabym architektem? Go ahead, gdybym miała zmienić pracę, zostałabym architektem. And now, if your answer was, if I had to change my job, I would become an architect, then you're definitely not the only one, okay? Because this is probably one of the most common, mistakes, I would say, that I hear during my one-to-one classes. Because the problem is, that if you say, if I had to, then basically it means gdybym musiała, okay? So if I had to change my job would mean gdybym musiała zmienić pracę. And here we want to say gdybym miała zmienić pracę, gdybym miała zamiar zmienić pracę, gdybym miała zmienić pracę, okay? So this is a completely different meaning, okay? So if I had to change my job has a completely different meaning, okay? So how do we actually say gdybym miała coś zrobić? Gdybym miała zmienić pracę? Let's find out, okay? So the structure is very simple. If I were to do something. If I were to do something. For example, our sentence, if I were to change my job, I would become an architect. If I were to change my job, I would become an architect. And now have a look. This is still the second conditional, okay? Drugi okres warunkowy. So after if, we've got this past simple tense, and then in the other part of the sentence, we have this would. So if I were to change my job, I would become an architect. But the meaning is slightly different to, the second conditional, because now have a look. If you say, if I changed my job, I would become an architect, that actually means gdybym zmieniła pracę, zostałabym architektem. Gdybym zmieniła pracę, okay? If I changed my job. And if I were to change my job, I would become an architect means gdybym miała zmienić pracę, zostałabym architektem. So it kind of says that if you were going to change your job, you would become an architect. I know the difference is very subtle, but in a minute we're going to practice based on some sentences to be translated and, you will feel the difference, you will get the difference, okay? So very often you will hear this structure if I were to do something in business conversations, in presentations, in interviews, or whenever someone is talking about some kind of imaginary situations, okay? And by the way, you might ask me, okay, Asha, why do we say if I were to and not if I was to change my job? So you may sometimes hear native speakers say if I was using the second conditional, but in most cases, it's just more natural to use if I were in the second conditional, okay? So for example, you must be familiar with the expression, if I were you, I would do something. Okay, so of course you may sometimes hear native speakers say if I was you, but it's definitely less common, right? So it's much more natural to say if I were you, if I were to do something. And before we move on to the practice section, let's finally kind of sum up these three very similar structures, okay? Because although they look alike, they mean completely different things, okay? So the first one, if I had to change my job, gdybym musiała zmienić pracę, okay? So maybe I had no other choice. Maybe someone forced me to change my job, okay? And now compare it with if I changed my job. And this is the standard second conditional, and it means gdybym zmieniła pracę, if I changed my job. Okay, so standard second conditional, imaginary situation. And finally, if I were to change my job, gdybym miała zamiar zmienić pracę. Okay, so it also belongs to the second conditional, but it sounds a bit more hypothetical, I would say. You're talking about your intentions. If I were to change my job, gdybym miała zmienić pracę. Okay, so now let's practice this structure based on sentences to translate. So enough of my monologue, it's time for you to practice, right? So the first one, let's translate. Gdybym miała przeprowadzić się za granicę, wybrałabym Hiszpanię. Go ahead. And the answer, if I were to move abroad, I would choose Spain. Repeat after me. If I were to move abroad, I would choose Spain. Okay? Gdybym miała przeprowadzić się za granicę, wybrałabym Hiszpanię. And by the way, this bym cluster, ta zbitka bym, is almost always translated as would. Okay? Wybrałabym, zrobiłabym, poszłabym. I would choose, I would go. Okay? I would do something. Okay, sentence number 2. Gdybym miała założyć własną firmę, otworzyłabym małą kawiarnię. Go ahead. Okay, the answer. If I were to start my own business, I would open a small cafe. If I were to start my own business, I would open a small cafe. Of course, you could say I'd open a small cafe. Okay, next one. Gdybym miała wybrać kolejny język obcy, wybrałabym włoski. Go ahead. If I were to choose another foreign language, I would choose Italian. If I were to choose another foreign language, foreign, by the way, another foreign language, I would choose Italian, or a very nice phrasal verb, I would go for Italian. So choose or go for Italian, okay? Because we don't want to repeat the same verb. So if I were to choose another foreign language, I would choose Italian. So if you don't want to repeat the verb, then you can just say, I'd go for Italian. Okay, next sentence. Gdybym miała pracować z dowolnego miejsca na świecie, wybrałabym Portugalię. Go ahead. So, if I were to work remotely from anywhere in the world, I would choose Portugal. Once again, repeat after me. If I were to work remotely from anywhere in the world, I'd choose Portugal. Okay, are you with me? Next one. Gdybym miała dać Ci jedną radę, skupiłabym się na moich umiejętnościach komunikacji. Go ahead. Okay, ready? If I were to give you one piece of advice, I'd focus on my communication skills. Together, if I were to give you one piece of advice, I'd focus on my communication skills. And by the way, remember in English you can't say one advice because the word advice is uncountable, niepoliczalne. So you can't say one advice, two advices, okay? Not possible. It's like information. You can't add this S ending. So if you really want to say one, then you can say one piece of advice, the same one piece of information, okay? But you can't say two advices or two information, not possible. So if I were to give you one piece of advice, I would focus, by the way, focus, pronunciation, on my communication skills. And the last one, let's translate. Gdybym miała zacząć wszystko od początku, zrobiłabym dokładnie to samo. And the answer, if I were to start all over again, I would do exactly the same thing. Together, if I were to start all over again, I'd do exactly the same thing. Okay, so as you can see, this isn't a completely new grammar structure because you're probably familiar with the second conditional, right? It's simply a more advanced version of something you probably already know, right? And this is exactly what takes your English to the next level, I would say, because speaking advanced English isn't only about learning new grammar. Very often it's just about replacing simple structures with the ones that sound a little more natural, more elegant, more professional. And by the way, jeśli słuchając tego odcinka pomyślałeś, kurczę, chyba muszę sobie odświeżyć te okresy warunkowe, te conditionale, to koniecznie sprawdź mój kurs Okresy warunkowe w Business English and Lifestyle, gdzie omawiam wszystkie conditionals, konstrukcje z wish, if only i wiele innych struktur, of course na praktycznych przykładach z życia i pracy, a nie na takich suchych regułkach gramatycznych. Link do kursu znajdziesz w opisie tego odcinka. Cheers!